I hope you can hear me and that the mic is functioning properly. Well, ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Museum of Modern Art and to this lecture by Professor Chomsky, which is being held in conjunction with a major exhibition on East Timor, which can be seen in the downstairs in the restaurant. And I hope that you will be able to see it after this meeting. It'll be open for half an hour afterwards. The format of tonight will be that I will make a very short opening address. I will then turn to João Boavida, who is an East Timorese, who is now studying at Campion Hall, to give something of an impression of what it has been like to actually live through the years of the Indonesian military occupation, and to particularly dwell on the developments which have happened within the East Timorese Church, the Catholic Church of East Timor, and the way in which that has focused in and helped to sustain the growing nationalist resistance in East Timor. Arnold Cohen will then follow. Arnold has been almost single-handed the architect of keeping East Timor in front of the public eye in the United States during 16 years when it was extremely difficult for much of that time to really be able to hold it as an issue of major public concern because of the way in which the press and those who could report what had been going on in East Timor were excluded and were banned from visiting the territory, and also from what Professor Chomsky will be talking about in the fourth presentation, the international matrix which has kept East Timor in the position it has been in during the past 16 to 17 years. I'm a specialist on Indonesian history, and to my shame, it took me nearly 10 years to actually realize what was happening in East Timor. I remember the first indication that something was pretty seriously wrong was when I was sitting in a restaurant in Leiden and read that 5 Western journalists, 2 Britons, Australians and New Zealander, had been shot and killed while covering the war at Balibo in October of '75. And I thought, well, it's a bit odd for 5 journalists and cameramen just to be wiped off the face of the earth just like that, just fulfilling their duties. And it was not until 1983 when I was asked to review the book written by James Dunn, an excellent book on East Timor called Timor, A People Betrayed, that I realized what had happened to them, that they'd been shot in cold blood by the Indonesian army, and that not only they had died, but somewhere around 100,000 Timorese out of a population of 688,000 had died in the first 3.5 years of the Indonesian occupation alone. Per capita and in terms of the suffering per square inch in East Timor, certainly perhaps greater than that even of Pol Pot's Cambodia. In the following year, after '83, we tried to hold a meeting to coincide with a visit to Oxford by Jose Ramos Horta, who later came as a visiting fellow to St. Anthony's, and like Arnold has been very much instrumental in terms of holding the cause of East Timor aloft in the UN and in major international circles, in the circles of diplomacy and international relations. For a very long period of time, he has been a principal advocate of East Timor's right of self-determination and the right for a future which the people of East Timor can decide for themselves. And when we organized a meeting in New College, barely 20 people turned up. It was a beautiful hall, as large as this, but 20 people were there. And I think it's a measure of the change which has been wrought during the past year, a change which occurred because of the massacre, the Santa Cruz massacre, and the way in which that massacre was reported in the West. 2 of the journalists and photographers who were there at the time, Steve Cox, who took the photographs, some of which you can see downstairs in the exhibition, Peter Gordon, who headed the Yorkshire television team, which made the very moving documentary on East Timor, which was shown in January last year, both are here tonight. And it's due to the courage of Peter and Steve, Chris Wenner, who actually took the footage, the video footage in the cemetery itself, and many others who supported that work, that the world knew about what had been going on, something of what had been going on in East Timor. It was certainly not the first massacre. Aria Branca, La Cluta, Craras, there had been many massacres which had punctuated the bloody rule and occupation of the Indonesians since 1975, but this was the first time that it was actually shown across the world. Australian customs officials and authorities tried to, in fact, confiscate the tape, so sensitive was Australia to the ramifications of showing that film. And it's to their credit and to their enormous courage that we know today what we do know about East Timor, and a room like this can be filled almost to capacity in order to hear a talk on East Timor. No doubt the character of the main speaker tonight, Professor Chomsky, has been a major draw. We've hijacked him from the philosophers for one night, and we're very pleased to have been able to do so. But it's also, I think, very much due to the publicity and to the awareness, the growing awareness, which has enabled such a gathering to come into being. We'd like to send a message tonight to the people of East Timor that they have not been forgotten, that they have a hope for a better world, and that Oxford, which has a link now with the presidency in the United States, can have an influence on events, perhaps larger than one might think. There will be a student club and student society association which will be founded, called the Friends of East Timor, which will be founded at St. Anne's, and the founders are here tonight, and if you would like to know more about it, you can get in touch with me or others who are involved with work on East Timor. So without further ado, I will turn to João Boavida, who is a graduate student at Campion Hall, working on a thesis to do with nationalism and religion in East Timor. And most of all, he has been a personal witness to the events which we'll be talking of tonight. Thank you.
When I first went to Australia in 1987, I was invited to give a talk at one of the universities in Melbourne. I was quite nervous at the time because my English wasn't very good. And before the talk, there was a student who came to me and asked me whether I was the speaker. And I said yes. She then went on saying that she knew quite well about the plight of the Timorese people and that she was very upset about her government's policy on East Timor. And then she asked me where exactly East Timor was. And she wondered whether it was somewhere in the northern suburb of Victoria. And of course I said yes, but a bit further north. So we literally went through all the suburbs around Victoria, and we ended up at the top end of Australia, which is Darwin. By then she realized the mistake she had made, that she simply had mistaken East Timor with one of the Aboriginal tribes in Australia. Well, what exactly I want to say tonight, it's nothing complex. The simple fact that the Timorese struggle still survives today, it is mainly due to the Catholic Church and its priests in East Timor. And by this, I don't mean to undervalue the spirit of nationalism of the Timorese people themselves, and nor do I overlook the efforts of individuals and group solidarities around the world. But there is certainly an explosive phenomenon which has taken place in East Timor over the last 17 years. And this phenomenon is the real religious element, which I'm going to describe it briefly in the following terms. First and foremost, since the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, the Timorese Church has adopted an attitude of mutual accommodation with the Timorese people. Throughout the 17 years of occupation, the Catholic Church in East Timor has given all sorts of supports and in several ways to the suffering East Timorese people. In other words, the Timorese Catholic Church has been the only and real haven in East Timor under those 17 years and continues to be. And secondly, as the Timorese Church began to look at the Bible from the underside, that is, from the perspective of the suffering Timorese people, many East Timorese came in mass, in big numbers, and converted to Catholicism. From 30% of Catholics in 1975, when the Indonesians, or when the Portuguese government left East Timor, the number went up 60%, and now the total number of those converted to Catholicism is something around 95%. If the figure means anything at all, it must mean that this is a potentially important unifying factor for the Timorese people in the face of this real threat inflicted upon the Timorese people on the part of the Indonesian government. And thirdly, if the struggle of East Timor still survives, this is mainly because the Timorese Church has restrained itself from becoming part of the Indonesian Bishops' Conference. And this simply means that while the socio-political structures in East Timor have been suppressed to a certain degree, the Catholic Church itself, with 90% of the population, are still directly answerable to the Vatican. And this is in some ways seen in a very political and diplomatic terms, in that we, the Timorese people, in fact, we are still independent from the Indonesians. And the Indonesian government is entirely aware, like the Timorese people themselves, that this has been the only main stumbling block on its way to fully integrate East Timor into the Republic of Indonesia. Well, I am bringing up my talk in this formula, because I wasn't warned that I was going to give this talk tonight. So I should conclude my views in that I will not be surprised if sooner or later the Timorese and Indonesian confrontation will take a different level of conflict, that is, the religious one. Because we have to bear in mind that although the Indonesian state is not an Islamic state, it is nevertheless the largest Muslim country in the world in terms of population. And to come to East Timor itself, we are looking at something like 600,000 people. And given that 95% of the Timorese people are now Catholics, we could soon face a very different struggle, a very different fight or confrontation or conflict, that is the religious one between the East Timorese and the Indonesians. Well, as a Timorese, all I want to say, or perhaps to appeal to you, first of all, I should thank you for coming. And I'm sure what Professor Chomsky is going to tell us will be most interesting. But my only appeal is that last year, the British aid to the Indonesian government amounted to some 15 million pounds. Well, this might be insignificant, but it altogether makes up some over $2 billion that the Indonesian government has been receiving from the international community. All I want you to do is to write to your MPs not to stop the aid to the Indonesian government, because after all, the Indonesian government is very much an aid dependent. But all I want you to do is to ask your MP and to ask the British government that any forthcoming aid to the Indonesian government will have to be connected to the human rights situation, not only in East Timor, but also in Indonesia. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank John Leslie for his work over the past year and a half on this exhibition, without which it would be impossible. The quality of this is largely due to him and to the courage of the photographers. One thing that I'd like to say regarding the level of awareness of East Timor over the years, I'm reminded of an incident in early 1979 when a Somalia-like situation was brewing in East Timor, largely owing to Indonesian military operations. I was sitting in a coffee shop in New York with José Ramos Horta, who was then the representative of East Timor's independence movement at the United Nations. And the waiter in the coffee shop asked José, "Where are you from?" And José said, "Brazil." And I said, "José, why did you do that?" And he said, "I'm just tired of explaining to people. I really want to, take some time off and not be bothered, and it's just too long and too complicated." Well, later that year, some awareness started to break through in the American press, and Noam Chomsky was responsible, along with people from the Timorese Catholic Church and other people with connections to that church. Noam Chomsky was giving some talks at various places where there were editorial writers for large American newspapers. And Noam was pointing out what was going on in East Timor, and the editorial writers and other people were quite chagrined that they couldn't really point to much of anything that they had said or done. And then when refugees and other people showed up with evidence, we were able to get in and see them quite quickly, and they were the major newspapers were rather anxious to do something, at least for a time. Of course, they would never admit that it was because Noam Chomsky had raised questions about their professional performance. But in any case, it all fits together, because if one skips ahead to the period surrounding the Gulf War, Professor Chomsky coincidentally was coming to Britain to speak at a conference put on by the Catholic Institute for International Relations in London. And he pointed out quite properly that Britain and the United States were going after Saddam Hussein, yet nobody had thought of bombing Jakarta in response to what the Indonesians had been doing for all those many years in East Timor. As a result of this, some journalists in the British press became interested in going to Timor and investigating the situation, notably Hugh O'Shaughnessy for the Observer. But not only him, there were other people, in addition to Yorkshire Television, who, to their credit, were already interested and were already investigating the situation. But all of these various trails led to the 12th of November last year, because were it not for efforts on the part of people like Noam Chomsky, the church people from East Timor, it would have been impossible to spread the kind of background awareness that enabled the journalists who were there at the time to have a receptive audience on the outside. And, you know, were it not for the efforts of these people, the American Congress would not have become involved to the extent that there was a basis of concern when the massacre took place last year. And within recent weeks, U.S. military training to Indonesia was cut off. It was the first sanction of any kind that the United States has carried out against Indonesia in the 17 years since the invasion of East Timor. We're in a situation now where the president-elect of the United States, Bill Clinton, has made a statement some months ago during the New York primary, saying that American policy on East Timor had been unconscionable and he would do much more. The real issue, of course, is how much will the well-entrenched interests, business interests and other kinds of international financial interests that have prevented action directly or indirectly on the Timor question these 17 years, how well they will succeed in getting to Clinton and stopping any action before it begins. But one thing is for sure, that the work of the Timorese independence movement in staying alive all these years against tremendous odds. I mean, if one looks at the photographs downstairs from people in 1975, I mean, most of these people who were known then are either dead or in prison or house servants for the Indonesian military, and yet a new generation has sprung up that refuses to be intimidated. And so all of these factors, combined with the absolutely key role of Yorkshire Television in getting filmed evidence, first of the long-term pattern of Indonesian atrocities, and second, and most importantly, of the massacre that took place last November, assures that we're not going to return to the kind of silence that existed many years before. And I think that, you know, this Oxford-educated American president may have a little more than he's bargained for in Congress and from the international media. And so I think on that note, Noam Chomsky can tell you a little bit about the context that brought us to where we are today. Thanks.
Let me begin with the title of the exhibit, 1974-92, Years of Silence, Images of Resistance. The title is appropriate. I'll add a slight quibble in a moment. But it does omit a lot, of course, and I'd like to concentrate actually on what it omits, namely the years of silence prior to 1974, which, in my opinion, are critical for understanding what has been happening in relation to East Timor since that time, and also provide an extremely illuminating insight into the nature of Western civilization, I think, if we're willing to take a close look at it. The years of silence with regard to Indonesia, they go back actually almost 500 years. That's the first European settled colony. But let's start with the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, there was a New World Order, as it was in fact called, which was unusually well and carefully designed. The reason that that was possible was because there was one global power that had a historically unprecedented degree of wealth and military force at its command, and intended to organize the world in the interests of domestic power centers, and did so in a sophisticated and careful way. It happens to be a very free society, maybe the most free in the world, and there's an enormous amount of information about what was done, so the contours and character and details of the planning are quite well understood. And they're not, I won't run through the whole story, but the basic outlines are pretty clear. Actually, the basic outlines were perhaps put most lucidly by Winston Churchill in 1945, when he was talking about how the world should be organized. And he said that the government of the world should be in the hands of the rich nations, the rich countries, the rich men who are living at peace in their habitations, rather ample habitations, the satisfied nations who already have what they need, and they should run the world. He said, our power has placed us above the rest. The rest should stay in the servants' quarters. If they start to try to have some influence or control, they'll just cause problems, but we're already satisfied. We already own everything. So as long as we run the world, everything will be fine. The rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations. The people in the servants' quarters repeatedly are not all that happy about it. There's an expression of that in this morning's Guardian. The chairman of the South Commission, Julius Nyerere, has another plea which will not be listened to for a different form of world order, but they keep making these unseemly noises and doing unpleasant things, and they have to be controlled, often stamped in the face, to show where they belong. That's basically the history of the world. There's a domestic analog as well. Now, the actual architects of policy they describe the matter less lyrically than Churchill, and somewhat more explicitly, and they also didn't exactly share his conception of where Britain was going to fit into this system, much to his dismay. Out of politeness, I'll leave out what they said about it privately. But the general idea was the same, just a different choices as to who was going to run the show. The general idea was to be that the mansions of the rich had to be reconstructed, primarily what were called the Great Workshops, Germany and Japan. German-based Europe and Japan and its periphery, they were going to be the centers of the industrial world, subordinated to the United States, of course. Germany and Japan had just demonstrated their prowess in the preceding years, and they in fact had only made one mistake. They didn't do it subordinated to the United States. They did it on their own, and that doesn't work, as Saddam Hussein learned in 1990. As long as you carry out your atrocities under orders or subordinated to the master, it's just fine. You can read that every morning in the British press these days. But if you do it in defiance of the master, that won't work. But in 1945, they had learned their lesson, and now they had to be reconstituted, but under U.S. domination. Other, as Kissinger put the point some years later, other powers have regional responsibilities, which they are to carry out within the overall framework of order managed in Washington. That's the way the world was supposed to be. By the time Kissinger said it, it was getting hard to impose those rules, but in 1945 it wasn't very difficult. So Japan had to be offered what George Kennan, one of the leading architects of policy, head of the State Department planning staff, policy planning staff, Japan had to be given what Kennan called its empire toward the south. Western Europe had to be granted the opportunity to exploit Africa, as Kennan put it, for its reconstruction. Britain would share with the United States in running the energy reserves of the Middle East, but with the United States on top. And the Western Hemisphere would be completely in the hands of the United States, and everyone would be kicked out, including Britain and France. And that's roughly the story. Southeast Asia had a role in this. Southeast Asia, as the policy planning staff of the State Department put it, was to fulfill its main function as a source of raw materials and markets for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, and of course to extend and strengthen overall U.S. power as well. Now, within Southeast Asia, Indonesia had the key role simply because of its wealth. Indonesia, as Kennan, going back to Kennan again, who was a leading figure in designing the post-war world, Kennan described, in 1948, described the problems of Indonesia. I'm quoting, "The problems of Indonesia are the most crucial issue of the moment in our struggle with the Kremlin." It's 1948, so not a small role. The phrase struggle with the Kremlin is a code word for conflict with independent nationalist forces and tendencies that interfere with the service role of the South. They may have a connection with the Kremlin or they may not. That's more or less incidental. It's their independence that's intolerable. They are hungry nations interfering with the rich men who are supposed to rule the world, and that's not their role. Their role is to be servants. If you read through the American planning record, these dangerous elements are described regularly as ultra-nationalists or radical nationalists, or sometimes communists. The Kremlin itself was an enemy largely for the same reason. It had pulled out of the Third World in 1917, and as one high-level planning study put it, the problem that the communists posed was their unwillingness or inability to complement the industrial societies of the West. They were radical nationalists, big, powerful ones in that case, but little ones are also unacceptable. There's a more general problem, or sort of another aspect to this problem of radical nationalists who interfere with the proper rule of the world by the rich men. That's a problem which became quite serious in Indonesia. It was described by President Eisenhower in the mid-50s. He said he was complaining about what he called the ability of the communists to appeal to the masses, something which we have no capacity to duplicate, he said. Somehow what we're trying to offer the masses doesn't get much enthusiasm among them. And his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, added that the communists appeal to the poor, who are always trying to plunder the rich. That's the big problem of world history. Somehow, since when we call upon the rich to plunder the poor, it's hard to duplicate this appeal to the masses. Nobody ever figured out exactly why, but some failure of public relations involved. Well, when you can't suppress, if you can't deal with these criminals who are trying to plunder the rich, or the other criminals who are appealing to them, if you can't suppress them in one or another way, you may have to turn to the ultimate weapon, namely extermination. And in fact, that brings us to Indonesia. Indonesia was supposed to be, in this New World Order, granted a kind of nominal independence, but under Dutch tutelage. The general idea was, as an early CIA memorandum put it, that we're in favor of recognizing the national aspirations of the former colonial powers, but that has to be balanced against the needs of the former colonial powers themselves. And when that balance raised the problem, there was never any question about which interest was going to win out. In Indonesia, there were essentially three forces. There was President Sukarno, the leader of the nationalist movement, who was an independent nationalist and therefore already unacceptable. Then there was a mass-based popular party, the Indonesian Communist Party, which was, needless to say, totally unacceptable. And thirdly, there was the army, which more or less shared U.S. aims and was therefore always referred to as the moderates or the pragmatists. These are technical terms that you have to understand. A pragmatist is somebody who does what we want. We're pragmatic by definition because we always do what we want. And others are pragmatic if they go along with it. And moderates are those who are pragmatic. So these are some of the terminology of political discourse you have to master if you want to become a professor somewhere. So the army were moderates, and the Communist Party was just more of these guys trying to plunder the rich. They were engaged in what was called in those days concealed aggression or internal aggression. That's a term that refers to political victories by the wrong people. That was a problem all over the world and always has been. The Indonesian, I should say that there was a lot of concern that there would be an internal victory by concealed aggression, that is, by political means, since that was the only mass-based party, and that obviously had to be stopped. Kennan, again in 1948, said that if the Communist Party did manage to take power internally, that would be an infection, he said, that would spread over all South Asia and cause enormous problems, and of course was unacceptable. And recall that Indonesia was regarded as the major issue in our struggle with third world nationalism at the time, struggle with the Kremlin and code words. Timor actually was mentioned in this internal planning. I can only find one reference to it by leading State Department Roosevelt advisor Sumner Welles, who mentioned back in the early 40s that he thought, when they were talking about the future of various parts of the world, that Timor has a right to independence, but he said it would certainly take 1,000 years. So we don't have to worry about that. There was an army massacre and repression. The moderates did their job in 1948. Still, Sukarno remained in power. The United States was never very happy with that. The CIA began to support right-wing parties. That didn't work. They supported an insurrection in 1957 and 58 that was put down. The U.S. then turned to a classic technique for overthrowing civilian government, one that's used over and over again, namely cut off any aid or assistance or support to the government, but maintain, in fact, even increase military aid. That's a natural way to overthrow a civilian government. After all, who's going to overthrow it? That's actually, as far as I can see, what lies behind the Iran-Contra story of the 1980s, from the early 1980s, the United States was trying to overthrow the government of Iran in the classic fashion, supporting the military, cutting relations with civilians, as one of the leading Israeli figures, Uri Librani, who was later identified as being involved in this, as he said, in fact, over BBC, and who had a very good program on this in 1982. He said, if we can find an Iranian general who can shoot down 1,000 people in the streets, we can restore the situation that existed under the Shah. And that was done in Chile. It was also done in Indonesia. So that's the policy that began after the failure of the 58 rebellion. Now, there was a lot of concern about the prospects. Didn't know if it was going to work. One of the leading U.S. specialists on Indonesia, Guy Pawker, worked with the Rand Corporation and the Pentagon. He, in 1962, he urged his contacts in the Indonesian military to, in his words, to strike and to sweep their house clean. A year later, William Kintner, another professor teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, expressed his concern over, again, this concealed aggression, the danger that there might be just a political takeover from inside by the only mass-based political party, which would be a total disaster. And he therefore said that with Western help, free Asian political leaders, together with the military, must liquidate the enemy's political and guerrilla armies. Now, the prospects of liquidating the enemy's political armies were uncertain. Pawker, again in 1964, wrote that he was concerned because the Indonesian military, he said, probably lacked the ruthlessness and discipline that made it possible for the Nazis to suppress the communists in Germany. However, it turned out that his pessimism was, I should say incidentally, that this was the same concern that the Kennedy administration felt about the Vietnamese generals. In recently released documents, Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, in 1963, complained about the same thing. He said, the South Vietnamese just lack the discipline and violence and savagery of the Nazis, and they can't do what we want them to do. We don't know how. They're supposed to have reserves of violence, but we can't seem to get that organized. Well, in the case of Indonesia, it turned out that the pessimism was unfounded when Pawker, in fact, pointed this out a couple of years later. There were 6 Indonesian generals assassinated on October 30th in 1965, and then this Suharto took over, and then came this huge bloodbath. And a couple of years later, Pawker said that the assassination of the generals elicited the ruthlessness that I had not anticipated and led to the death of a large number of communist cadres. They did act like Nazis, thankfully, and somewhere around 500,000, or nobody really knows, 500,000 to 1 million, some number of people were slaughtered in the hugest bloodbath since the Holocaust, mostly landless peasants, and the Communist Party was wiped out, no more fear of any popular political organization, and the generals were firmly in power, and Sukarno soon disappeared. We don't know a lot about the U.S. involvement in this. The documentary record still has not been declassified, but there's enough to know that the U.S. supported the coup openly, gave aid. The government, that is, reacted with enthusiasm to the massacre. Its only hesitation, which is repeated in internal documents, is the fear that if U.S. support for the massacre was too overt, it might play into the hands of Sukarno and undercut the good work that the army was doing. In the public domain, we of course have a complete record, and that's extremely illuminating. There was total euphoria all over the West as the corpses, the piles of corpses mounted. It's hard to find an exception to this. Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, testified before Congress shortly after all the basic facts were known about the slaughter. He was asked about the U.S. policy of aiding the Indonesian military in the early 60s, at a time when we were extremely hostile to Indonesia, and he was asked whether this paid dividends. And he said, yes, in retrospect, it had paid dividends, referring proudly to the hundreds of thousands of slaughtered people. The blood was still flowing at that time. Later, he wrote privately to President Johnson that what was particularly helpful, he said, was bringing Indonesian military officers to the United States, to places like Harvard, where they got what he called the right orientation and learned the skills that they were able to employ with such efficiency in Indonesia. Freedom House published an advertisement by a group of 114 people who described themselves as the moderate segment of the intellectual community, in which they lauded the U.S. war in Vietnam because it had provided a shield for what they referred to as the dramatic changes that had taken place in Indonesia, the most dramatic being this huge bloodbath. In fact, that was the logic of the Vietnam War from the beginning, was to ensure that there would be no infection spreading from Vietnam. And the idea was that the resolve that was shown by the United States in attacking South Vietnam, what's called in doctrinally correct terminology, defending South Vietnam from its own people, another case of internal aggression, as it was called, the resolve that the U.S. showed in attacking South Vietnam and then the rest of Indochina encouraged the Indonesian generals and others in the neighborhood, like in Thailand and the Philippines and so on, to take things into their own hand, to strike and sweep their house clean, as Kintner put it, and to end any threat of other infections that might spread. McGeorge Bundy, years later, he was National Security Advisor, thinking back over this period, said that in retrospect he thinks that after the Indonesian coup in 1965, it was probably unnecessary for the United States to continue the war in Vietnam. Thinking it over, he says, we basically got what we wanted at that time. By end of 1965, Vietnam was pretty well destroyed anyway, and Indonesia was back under control, and other places the infections weren't spreading, so we probably made a tactical error by going on and costing ourselves too much pain and dollars. Time magazine, in one of the typical responses, had a cover story on what they called the West's best news for years. The title of the story was Vengeance with a Smile. It was 11 pages about what they described as the boiling bloodbath that took 400,000 lives, about which they were just euphoric and enthusiastic. The leading political commentator, the political columnist of the New York Times, James Reston, actually that phrase, leading political commentator, is another euphemism. It means the State Department spokesman in the New York Times. His job is to publish leaks that he got from some State Department official the day before and look like a big thinker because of this and so on. He published an article called, this is well into 1966 when everything was known, it was called Gleam of Light in Asia. And he said we shouldn't be so downbeat about the bad news from Vietnam. There's also good news in Asia. There's a gleam of light, namely Indonesia. And he said the United States is being kind of reticent about its role in all of this, but in fact, they're just kind of, they don't want to show off. I said the U.S. role was really much more significant than Washington is letting on. Without direct U.S. aid and involvement and encouragement, the Indonesian generals would never have been able to carry this off. I just out of some form of masochism, about a year ago, I went through the whole record of New York Times editorials on the topic in those years, and they're pretty remarkable. They're uniform, full of euphoric, completely, full of praise for what they called the Indonesian moderates, though they recognized that the moderates had carried out what they called a staggering mass slaughter. But that didn't change the fact that they were moderates, and that's right, remember, because they were pragmatists working for us. They said that the staggering mass slaughter carried out by the moderates does raise a critical question for Washington, but they were happy to see that the question had been answered correctly. The critical question was whether Washington should openly embrace and support the moderates or whether it should do it more quietly. And Washington had chosen the right path. Washington didn't embrace the new leaders too effusively, they said, because that would have hurt them, and that was very wise. That's the only critical. Meanwhile, Washington, they said, was giving them generous aid, which is the right thing, of course, but it was very nicely handled. There are other possible questions that might come to mind. They weren't raised, and in fact, I can't find them raised anywhere in Western commentary. You might, if you're equally masochistic, look back at the British press in those days and see what was said. As far as I can tell, I've only sampled outside the United States, it was pretty much the same. Euphoria over the gleam of light in Asia with this extraordinary massacre. By 1977, there had been a complete role reversal. One of the leading Asia hands, George MacArthur, wrote that the Indonesian Communist Party had, as he put it, subjected the country to a bloodbath. In other words, they had put their necks under the knife in another communist atrocity. And so it goes to the present. Just recently, the Christian Science Monitor had a review article on Indonesia in which it said that after his 1965 achievements, referring to Suharto, many in the West were keen to cultivate Jakarta's new moderate leader, Suharto, after he had done his job properly. Here in England, The Economist, shortly after, described Suharto as a person who is at heart benign, perhaps thinking of his attitude towards transnational corporations. Though The Economist recognized that there are what they called propagandists for the guerrillas who talk about the Army's savagery and torture and other fabrications of that sort. These people are propagandists for the guerrillas rather than, say, distinguished human rights activists because they have completely the wrong story to tell. And so it continues. The Indonesian generals fortunately acted like the Nazis, carried out a staggering mass slaughter, destroyed the danger of the concealed aggression by a political party that might have tried to plunder the rich or interfered with the rich men who rule the world. So naturally, everyone is euphoric. Their only concern is that maybe we'll look bad if we're too openly euphoric, so you got to do it quietly the way Washington did. Well, as I say, this casts quite an interesting light on Western civilization. One really has to read the originals in order to appreciate it. These are just samples, and they're quite astonishing. That's the context for the East Timor invasion. And now just a minor quibble about the title. The silence, I'll speak most about the United States here, which is where I've looked at it closely, in fact, comprehensively. The silence didn't begin in 1974, it began in 1975. In 1974 and 75, there was considerable coverage of East Timor, surprisingly. The coverage was in the context of the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, which caused much concern at the time because there was fear that that might stir up radical nationalist currents around the world interfering with the service function. That was taken very seriously, and in that context, there was a surprising amount of coverage of East Timor. The silence began really on December 19, not that there was truth, but there was coverage. The silence began in December 1975 with the Indonesian invasion. From then on, there's a sharp decline in coverage. It reaches zero literally in the United States and Canada, only two countries I looked at. It reaches zero in 1978, which is the year in which the atrocities peaked, and in which, in fact, Jimmy Carter took some time off from his sermons about human rights to increase U.S. aid to Indonesia because they were actually running out of arms in the war against this tiny country. As the massacres increased, the coverage declined, hitting zero as they peaked in 1978. It's what led to that Somalia-like situation that Arnold was describing. The U.S. was providing crucial military and diplomatic support to the invasion. That's not at issue. The U.S. was providing 90% of the arms. When the arms supply began to dwindle, increased the flow of arms. At the United Nations, Ambassador Moynihan, he takes credit in his memoirs for having, as he puts it, rendered the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it tried to do about Timor under State Department orders because, as he says, the United States wanted things to turn out as they did. He knows how they turned out. The next sentence says within a couple of months they'd killed 60,000 people, a proportion of the population comparable to what the Nazis had done in Eastern Europe during the Second World War, and then sort of on to the next topic. That's why he is regarded as a leading exponent of international law and human rights and the need to follow, always trotted out to talk about how holy and great international law is and how terrible it is that all sorts of third world maniacs undermine the United Nations and so on and so forth. The diplomatic and military support was critical and not secret, but silence, wrong story. It's like those propagandists for the guerrillas that The Economist is worried about, who are trying to impugn the noble character of this man who is at heart benign. There have been, just coming up to the present, in 1990-91, there was a kind of a surprising new focus on Timor, and as Arnold pointed out, it was in the context of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which was remarkably similar. A big, powerful country invading and conquering and annexing a small oil producer. Timor is, that's for certain, but it apparently has rich oil reserves in the Timor Sea between Timor and Australia. The two invasions are not entirely comparable. Historical actions never are. Suharto probably killed about, how many times? Probably 100 times as many people, I guess, in the invasion of East Timor. But aside from, in general, they had striking similarities, and it was hard not to notice them, and they were indeed noticed. There were various tortured explanations given as to why we were being noble in defending Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, and also being noble in supporting Indonesia while it was destroying East Timor. I'll put aside the explanations, which again have to be looked at to be believed, but there were some people who said it straight, to their credit. One of them was the Foreign Minister of Australia, Gareth Evans, who simply pointed out that there is no binding obligation not to recognize acquisition of territory by force. The world is an unfair place, littered with examples of acquisition by force. So let's be honest about it. At the same time, the Australian Prime Minister Hawke, said, big countries cannot invade small neighbors and get away with it. The weak will feel more secure because they know that they will not stand alone if they are threatened, now that all nations know that the rule of law must prevail over the rule of force in international relations. They know this because of the righteous Anglo-Americans who have established that lesson. Of course, he was talking about Iraq and Kuwait. These were side by side. In England, British intellectuals lectured with due gravity about the nobility of their ancient traditions, while British aerospace entered into the biggest military deal with any Southeast Asian nation right after the principles of international law had been upheld, this with Indonesia, right after principles of international law had been upheld in Kuwait. All of this goes by without anybody batting an eyelash. Occasionally you get a few words of explanation of how it really makes perfect sense, but that's about it. Actually, we're going through that right now. It's kind of amazing to see how compartmentalized minds can be. Big front page story in the British press for the last couple of days or weeks has been Matrix Churchill and that whole business. The fact that Britain was, in fact, as everyone knew for years, I don't know why they seem surprised about it, Britain and the United States were, of course, helping to arm their friend Saddam Hussein, who was a moderate. He was a moderate upholding stability, and in fact, he committed his first crime on August 2nd, 1990, when he stepped out of line. Up until then, he was just massacring Kurds and things like that, which is no big deal. So, of course, they were arming him and, in fact, keeping the British machine tools industry going and so on and so forth. That's on the front pages. At the same time, Britain is, I think, Peter Carey will tell the details, but I think that Britain has now become the leading military supplier to Indonesia. You can't make a distinction between Suharto and Saddam Hussein. They're the same, just clones, basically. So on the one hand, we're agonized about the past error, what happened. There'll be an inquiry and investigation about sending arms to Saddam Hussein. At the very same time, the British military industry is trying to whip up more arms sales for Indonesia, and that can go by in two sectors of the mind without any interference between them. Some curious thing about the way brains are hooked up. Curious thing that you see constantly when you look at international affairs and political culture. In November 1991, there was another revival of concern over Timor. What happened is the Indonesians made a tactical error. Namely, they carried out a massacre in front of television cameras. That is always a mistake. For those of you who hope to be national leaders, massacres have to be carried out when nobody's looking, or at least when the press pretends it's not looking. You can't carry them out while the television cameras are focused on them. That's a mistake that countries have found over and over again. And when you make this mistake, there's a routine that you go through. You set up an investigating commission which deals with it, and it gives some light taps on the wrist to the people responsible for the massacre, and then your friends abroad laud you for the magnificence of your willingness to come to terms with this kind of marginal deviation from your usual high principle, and everything goes back to where it was. That was the game that was played with regard to Indonesia as well this time. It didn't entirely work. For one thing, the television films did get shown. I don't think they've yet been shown in the United States, have they? Yes. Have they? Yeah. Of course, I don't watch television. I just read the newspapers. There's a limit to my masochism. But they have been in England. There was also the mistake of beating and practically killing a couple of Western reporters, 2 American reporters, a British reporter. That doesn't look very nice. So the matter has remained. And in fact, there were consequences. One consequence of the November 1991 massacre was that there was a sharp increase in the arrangements for oil leases in the Timor Sea. Australia's Gareth Evans' comments that I quoted before were in the context of a treaty that Australia had signed with Indonesia to exploit Timorese wealth. Raises a number of other questions. One might ask what the reaction would have been, say, if Libya had joined with Iraq to exploit Kuwaiti oil in the fall of 1990, but let's put that aside. After November 91, the dozens of Western oil companies from all the major countries raced into the Timor Sea to use these new opportunities to steal Timor's resources, thanks to the Australia-Indonesian treaty, which is now being questioned before the World Court. That was one consequence. Second consequence was here in Britain. Britain stepped up its military sales to Indonesia. A third consequence, which is a little different, was in the United States, which was interesting and surprising and significant for the future. There was, in the United States, Congress actually terminated the military aid to Indonesia. Now that means they terminated the arrangements for Indonesian officers to come to get training, to get the right orientation, as McNamara had put it. In Boston, there was an interesting sidelight to this on here it is, on the anniversary of the Dili massacre. The Boston newspaper has an article on November 12th, which says, headlined, "Indonesian General Facing Suit Flees Boston." And it starts by saying, an Indonesian general accused of contributing to the deaths of as many as 200,000 people has fled the Boston area after being sued by family members of a victim. Lawyers who filed the suit said yesterday. It was one of the people in charge of the massacre in Dili. He was apparently coming to Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, where they have a special program for third world murderers to teach them how to do it better next time. Harvard denied that he was attending school there, but that was apparently a lie. This happened last year, I should say, and it's becoming a pattern and an interesting one that others could follow. Last year at Harvard, they had another clone of Saddam Hussein and Suharto, General Gramajo of Guatemala, who's another moderate. He's the State Department favorite, in fact, for the next elections. He was the guy who was largely responsible for the genocidal massacres in the Guatemalan highlands in the early 1980s, which also led to a lot of euphoria and support in the West, I should say. There were reports in the Central American press that he was coming to Harvard. I suggested to some local activists that they look into it. Harvard denied it, but it turned out he was there. And on graduation day, the same law firm served him with a subpoena on graduation day, so it was hard to miss. And he fled the country and, in fact, forfeited the suit and owes $10 million. Now they did it again with the Indonesian general, and it's probably the same story. It's an interesting tactic. It'll become really interesting when they start applying it to the people who can't flee to their own countries. Then we'll really be in business. Anyway, these things happened. They happened because of intensive work of a very small number of people, in fact, primarily one. Arnold Cohen has been carrying this thing on his shoulders basically alone, with occasional help from someone else since the beginning. And it's a remarkable example of what a few people can do. It has gotten to the point where Indonesian generals can't come to Harvard anymore because they're going to have to flee the country because of the reaction to their atrocities, and where Congress will actually cut back and eliminate military aid, meaning it'll probably still go on, but through some more devious means. If the same thing happened in the United Kingdom, it could make quite a difference, a major difference, especially now that Britain has become certainly one of the major military supporters. That's the most important lesson to bear in mind, in my opinion. Ben Anderson, who's one of the world's leading specialists on Indonesia, just gave some talks in Australia in which he expressed his feeling that there is a fair chance for the first time that Indonesia may want to rid itself of what by now is becoming something of a nuisance. He quoted the foreign minister of Indonesia, who said that Timor is like a sharp piece of gravel in our shoes. And I think that tells us something. If we make that piece of gravel sharper, perhaps one of the world's major atrocity stories may finally be brought to an end. Thanks.
I think we have some time for questions. It may be that some people need to go, and please do so if you need to depart now, but there will be 10 minutes for questions which come up after of any of the 3 presentations which were made, particularly from Professor Chomsky's talk. So we just have an intermezzo for about a minute to resettle themselves. There is a chance for you to ask Professor Chomsky or João Govida or Arnold what it has been like to hold the fort in the United States in terms of the East Timor issue, and where developments might go from here, and what sort of pressure might be applied, particularly here in the United Kingdom, where an unconscionable level of military assistance and aid is still going without question, government to government, to the Indonesian generals. Yes.
Yes, my question is just something that I didn't quite hear. It was the second speaker, I believe, suggesting that we write to our MP or whatever and say, they actually cut or aid to Indonesia, but do something else. And I didn't catch what it was.
That was João. He was asking, you made an appeal at the end of your presentation to say, please take up your pens and write to your MPs. 15 million in overseas development aid goes to Indonesia every year, but you said, since that aid is useful, it should not just be cut, but it should be made conditional.
That's right. Yeah.
Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, practically, what I want you to do is to write to your MP and to ask him to intervene on behalf of the Timorese people in terms of not cutting the aid to the Indonesian government, but to attach strings to the aid itself. That is, to put conditionality on aid. I guess that's what I really want to say. Thanks.
Are there other questions?
Does he know what is the aid being spent on?
ODA assistance to Indonesia, what is it mainly spent on?
Sorry.
What is the ODA assistance mainly spent on at the present time?
I might be able to shed some light. Quite a lot of it's going on forestry, and quite a lot of the stuff that's going on forestry is in the form of an aid trade provision for the purchase of sophisticated telecommunications equipment to allow the Central Forestry Office to communicate with its offices round and about on the different islands. So you can draw your own conclusions.
What's the situation? I know it's a slightly different question, but what's the situation in West Irian now? Because there was a kind of precedent Indonesian invasion in West Irian in the 60s, and in the Moluccas previously. Are they sort of hands have been washed, you think?
Right. Well, I'll ask Arnold perhaps to add some things, but the questioner asked, is East Timor unique, or there are other areas of which Irian Jaya, West Irian, and the Republik Maluku Selatan, the RMS, which briefly attempted to get a secession from the Republic in 1950 to 52, what has happened in these areas? I would just like to preface any reply by saying that there is a very significant difference between East Timor and the other 2 areas which have been alluded to. In 1948, the Prime Minister of Indonesia, the soon to become Vice President of Indonesia, Mohammed Hatta, made a public statement about what the boundaries of the Republic would be. This was at a time when Indonesia, after the Second Police Action, was still deeply mired in its own guerrilla war against the Dutch. And he said that as far as we are concerned, the boundaries of the Republic will be exactly the same as those of the Netherlands East Indies, which of course did not include, from 1913, with the demarcation of the East-West Timor boundary, which was internationally demarcated, East Timor. So East Timor is a case of breach of international law, whereas as far as the Republic of the Moluccas or Irian, it is something which has occurred within an area which has been claimed and is part, in the Indonesian Jakarta view, of the Republic. The RMS is interesting because within Indonesia it is, I perhaps stand corrected as far as Aceh is concerned, but it is the one case of an attempt to secede from the Republic. 57, 58 were federal revolts, there have been federal revolts, but the RMS was an attempt to secede, and it was very much a legacy of a colonial past, namely that very special credits, very special arrangements, a very special culture grew up in the South Moluccas. Rather like the martial races of India, the Ambonese were used in the colonial army. They spoke Dutch. They had a sort of Dutch acculturation and religious acculturation, because most of them were Protestant, which set them apart from, at least culturally and religiously and in terms of their historical experience, somewhat apart from the rest of Indonesia. And then when the Republic gained its independence in 1949, its formal independence, they saw all these goodies drying up, and they were reluctant to go and sort of eke out an existence in the sort of El Al type suburbs of Amsterdam, and they wished to fight for their own independence. But that has, to a large extent, been extinguished, and a third and fourth generation have now grown up in the Netherlands, who don't want to go back to Indonesia particularly, who have now become acculturated to Dutch society, and that, to some extent, has wound down. As far as Irian Jaya is concerned, this is very much more akin to the situation in East Timor, with the proviso that it does form a part which has been claimed. And I think I would turn to maybe Arnold. Would you like to say something?
The only thing I would add to that is simply to say that the legal rights that the East Timorese have are really the only thing in the international sense that they've had going for themselves all these years. That is, the Indonesians don't have a right to East Timor. Now, the situation is very bad in West Irian, but it's a separate case. It has to be solved in its own terms, as do these other regional questions. It's not in any way to undercut or minimize what's happening in these places. But the legal rights are something that the East Timorese have to hold on to for dear life. I mean, now in Washington you have various moderate scholars and policy types who didn't really want to know about East Timor before, saying, well, look, let's solve the East Timor problem by democratizing Indonesia, and somehow the East Timorese will get their rights. And I say, what kind of talk is this? I mean, the Timorese are supposed to make some kind of backroom deal. Maybe we'll help you at some point. Maybe something will happen. I mean, the only reason that there's all this talk at all is because of the massacre last year and the fact that the situation continues to be serious and it won't really go away. I mean, just the other day, a leading columnist for the New York Times, one of their more decent commentators, mentioned East Timor as one of 3 issues that Bill Clinton should address. So it's quite different than it was, 25 years ago when James Reston was calling it a gleam of light in Asia. And in terms of television, there are more programs that are looking toward putting something on the air, and something was just on a couple of months ago. And so this is a serious problem next to the silence that existed all these years. But the idea is that the legal rights that the Timorese have to be held quite separate from any other issues with regard to the Indonesian archipelago.
Given the precedents of Nicaragua in the 70s and Guatemala in the 80s, has a decrease of U.S. aid to Indonesia been coupled with the rise in Israeli covert assistance to the government?
The question was about Guatemala and Nicaragua. Has the decline in US military aid to Central America, to Indonesia,
been accompanied by
a rise of
Israeli and other things? Well, actually, that was going on already in the 70s. I think it was 1978, I believe, Mondale, was that when he went to? Yeah, in 1978, the Vice President, Walter Mondale, went to Indonesia spreading the message of human rights. Remember, that was the soul of our foreign policy in those days. And he was very impressed with what he saw in Indonesia, so impressed that he contacted Washington from there, telling them they got to really send Indonesia some advanced jet planes. This was right at the peak of the massacres in East Timor. And there are various congressional restrictions on that. It's hard. So they got Israel to send them American planes, Skyhawks, I think, in 1978 to help out the good work that Indonesia was doing for human rights there. Whether that's exactly what's going on in that connection in the 1980s, I don't know. These things are not easy to determine. The United States is an unusual country in that we actually we can get to know what military aid is going. Sometimes it takes a little work, but there are records and they're more or less accurate, and if they're not, you can get somebody in Congress or somewhere to dig out the right ones. Most countries you can't find out. So, for example, I think it would be extremely difficult to find out, say, what Belgian aid is going to various countries. At least I don't know anybody who's tried to do it, and I suspect if you tried to do it, it would be very hard. I don't know what the situation is like in England. In the case of Israel, it's basically, these are all state secrets. I mean, you can learn about them from one or another leak or something of that kind. So all kinds of things are going on that, you can only find out about by investigative reporting and all kind of inquiries and so on and so forth. It's not that the United States doesn't carry out clandestine activities. Of course it does, plenty of them, huge ones. But at least things like direct military aid are pretty public. So for example, it is possible to learn, say, too late, a couple of years later, that during the late 1970s, when the Carter administration claimed that it was cutting out aid to Guatemala, as the atrocities were really peaking, that was just a lie. The Pentagon printouts show that the military aid went at approximately the normal level right through the 70s, barely changing. In the case of Indonesia, after the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, there was a public statement that the U.S. Was imposing a 6-month arms ban on Indonesia until the situation sorted out. I think it was Ben Anderson who figured that out. Ben Anderson, who I mentioned before, discovered that was another lie. And in fact, not only had that 6-month ban been so secret that the Indonesians had never heard about it until they heard this announcement, but also during the 6-month ban, the United States actually approached Indonesia with offers for new counterinsurgency equipment, counterinsurgency aircraft and so on. So if you work in relatively open countries like the United States and probably England, you can probably get the answers to these things. But in most countries, it's very hard to penetrate, and people don't try, interestingly.
Vince?
Yeah. Could you perhaps, Arnold, the campaigning, explain what has been the reaction of the ASEAN countries, the other countries in the region, as well as in the South, within the United Nations? And why do you think there perhaps hasn't been more support for East Timor coming from the southern countries over the last 15 years?
Well, regarding the ASEAN countries, initially when East Timor was invaded, Singapore was quite upset and abstained on the first UN vote, remembering the old period of confrontation with Malaysia, worrying that the Indonesians could potentially harm them under wrong circumstances. Now, due to the fact that ASEAN is a regional alliance, I think the Indonesians were able to whip everybody more or less into line, and everyone more or less goes along with everyone else's policies, and so they were able to enforce some kind of regional discipline. One of the problems about the fact that there's not more support from the South is that the Indonesians have been able to call on certain countries that are with Indonesia in OPEC. And so that automatically takes out certain important countries. Then there's, say, a country like India seized Goa in the early 60s and doesn't really want anybody bringing up issues like this. And so they're able to separate, say, an important country like India. They're able to co-opt certain Islamic countries on basis of Islamic solidarity, and essentially use their old position as leader in the third world, an old position that really, dated back to the 50s, to really call in a lot of favors. I mean, for example, when East Timor was first invaded, the then foreign minister of Indonesia had been very close to what was then Yugoslavia. And they got the Yugoslavians essentially to help them within private diplomatic channels and amongst the Eastern Bloc and other non-aligned countries not to do anything. And so the Indonesians, being a big, powerful, third world country, after all, I mean, now they're the fourth largest country in the world after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the Timorese, in terms of third world support, had on their side at the beginning the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, and a number of other countries were helpful, but the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, as we know, have had their own problems, quite severe. And so I think that is largely what's lied behind the lack of support from the South. But I must add that the policy on East Timor that's enabled the Indonesians to do what they've done all these years has been, military and economic support from the West and Japan. So, and if the United States and other countries want this problem to be solved under the rubric of the United Nations, the opposition of certain southern countries is not going to make terribly much of a difference. I mean, it certainly didn't on Kuwait and other places.
Right. Do you want to comment on that? Mr. Chomsky, did you hear what the question was?
Since Kuwait was an artificial creation.
Yes, I mean, Kuwait is essentially a sort of concocted colonial.
Well, every country is an artificial creation. It's just a question of how many people you could kill before, you got the boundaries fixed where they were. In the South, the things called countries are the relics of European savagery. I mean, Europe, after all, conquered the world in a very savage and brutal fashion, and it left it a wreck. I'd sort of try to pick up the pieces after the Europeans got through with it, but boundaries have been put here and there and so on and so forth, and you kind of stick to them, like the Organization of African States insists upon keeping to the totally idiotic boundaries that were imposed by European colonialism, simply because they know they're right in doing it, because they know that once you start giving those up, you've got Yugoslavia. I mean, you have to pick the best of a lot of rotten choices after the European savagery swept through and decided it wasn't worth exploiting any longer. In the case of Iraq and Kuwait, the British simply drew the boundary where they wanted it for all the region. And the boundaries were drawn in such a way as to ensure that, in fact, you can read it, and a lot of the British records are open now, dealing with this, and they're very explicit. Back around the First World War, Britain decided that it didn't have the power any longer, didn't have the force to control the empire with troops. It was just, Britain was declining and couldn't do that any longer. So therefore, there were a couple of measures that were selected. One of them, which in fact was strongly supported by Winston Churchill, was to use poison gas. particularly against Kurds. He thought they were a particularly good choice. That, he said, will strike a lively terror in the hearts of uncivilized tribesmen. And he was very angry about the squeamishness of those in the Foreign Office who didn't like this idea. And in fact, that was used. There's Lloyd George, a couple of years later, insisted that Britain undermine the disarmament conference of 1932. There was a big disarmament conference which was trying to put a barrier against bombardment of civilians. And Britain succeeded in preventing that measure from going through because, as Lloyd George put it privately, we have to reserve the right to bomb the niggers. That's the British tradition, and that's British culture. You got to reserve the right to bomb the niggers. You got to use poison gas if you want to against uncivilized tribes. And these measures were required once you no longer had the force to just control the empire directly. The other technique that was used, and this brings us more directly to Iraq and Kuwait, is to I should say, incidentally, that if Britain were really a free country, this is the kind of thing you'd be learning in elementary school. You know, you wouldn't have to wait for somebody to tell it to you. Same holds for the United States and every other country, ceteris paribus. The other technique that was used, which was suggested by Lord Curzon and the Parliamentary Commission during the First World War, was to create what they called an Arab facades in the Middle East region, to veil colonial control behind constitutional fictions like buffer state and protectorate and so on. Those would be Arab facades. The idea, and that's the system that still exists until today. The idea is you've got to ensure that the wealth of the region goes to the West. Now that means the United States and Britain primarily, not to the local people. It's not doesn't belong to them. And the way you do that is by constructing an Arab facade, a family dictatorship, which is basically the local managers for the Western corporations and countries. And they can enrich themselves. The third world elites are allowed to enrich themselves if they do their job properly. But you got to make sure that the mass of the population doesn't get in on this act. It doesn't belong to them. And that's the history of Kuwait and Iraq. I mean, the boundaries were set up in such a way that Kuwait in particular, and in fact Saudi Arabia, the US did the same with Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf principalities. They are supposed to be Arab facades run by family dictatorships so weak that they do what you tell them. And if they get into trouble, they have regional enforcers like Israel and Turkey and Iran under the Shah, and they come in and smash people up. And if things really get out of hand, you call in the guys with the muscle, Britain and the United States, who really do the job properly for you. That's the structure of the system, and it remains that way. Kuwait was carved out as part of that system. If you want to really find out what went on, it's kind of amazing that during the Iraq-Kuwait war, people didn't look at this more carefully. But actually, I know only one researcher, a woman in Britain, Kirsten Kale, who wrote in Living Marxism on this, who actually looked at the proper documents. Amazing that nobody else looked. These are documents from late 50s, right after the Iraqi Revolution, which scared the daylights out of everybody because it was a nationalist revolution, which they thought at the time was Nasserite, that was taking over one of the oil-producing regions. Turned out it was no big problem, but it looked dangerous at the time. At that point, the British Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, flew immediately to Washington. They were very upset. The US invaded Lebanon right afterwards and threatened to use nuclear weapons, in fact, if things got out of hand. Selwyn Lloyd flew to Washington. They had discussions with Dulles and so on. It's all available in the British and American records, parallel. They say the same things. The decision was made to grant Kuwait nominal independence so that the infection wouldn't spread any further, the nationalist infection. However, as Lloyd put it internally, Britain reserves the right ruthlessly to intervene in case anything goes wrong in Kuwait, no matter what the source. In other words, anything goes wrong with this arrangement, we ruthlessly intervene. The United States, which is the big boy, takes the same right with regard to the big prize, namely Saudi Arabia. Britain gets the little one, Kuwait, the United States gets the big one, Saudi Arabia. And they explained the reasoning. Kuwaiti oil and the profits from it, particularly, not just the oil, but the profits from it, were very seriously needed to prop up the sterling area to maintain Britain's already sagging economy. And it's necessary to ensure that the Arab facade there keeps it flowing there. If they don't, we ruthlessly intervene. By the early 1970s, that was already beginning to become a problem for the United States as well. And in fact, both Britain and the United States gained when the price of oil, it was mixed, but they basically gained when the price of oil went up in the early 70s, for one thing, because they're both high-cost oil producers, but for another thing, because the oil companies are basically Anglo-American, and their prices went up even faster than the oil price, so the profits came back here and the United States primarily. So that's where Kuwait comes from. I mean, you can say, yes, it's illegitimate, but of course, name the state that isn't.
I think we'd like to thank you all for coming. Maybe we could take one more question. Oliver, would you like to?
When our last Prime Minister came into power, that is our present Prime Minister, John Major, he gave the impression of coming in with a geopolitically reformist stance. He was talking about nice things like a register of international weapons sales. One thought, well, this is a move in the right direction. This is a good thing. I think that in the light of Matrix Churchill, we now know what the true agenda was pretty clearly, even if all the documents haven't come to light. Now, in the United States, I have perhaps a similar feeling about Bill Clinton, that here is someone, coming in with a possibly somewhat geopolitically reformist stance. What is likely to happen in that arena?
Well, actually, George Bush, right after the Iraq war, so-called war, we should not really refer to it as a war. After the Iraq slaughter, a war is something where two sides shoot at each other. After that event, whatever you call it, was over, Bush had a triumphal speech in Congress where he talked about the great tragedy of the world, in particular the Middle East, namely proliferation of weapons. And now that we have this wonderful new world order, we're going to have to cut back on weapon sales, and we have to control all this and so on. And everybody applauded, and editorials and so on. A couple days earlier, the administration had presented to the Senate its plans for increased arms sales all over the world, particularly to the Middle East. Then they went up beyond. By now, the United States is so far in the lead in arms sales that you can't even count. They're peddling arms all over the place. The successes in destroying a defenseless country in Iraq were where you were guaranteed that they wouldn't shoot back, so that's the way you become a hero. Those were used as a sales device. There's a big air show in Paris every year, and the next Paris air show, all the companies went and they showed off these wonderful things that you could use to bomb the niggers and when they can't shoot back and so on. And you try to sell them to other killers so they'll use them too. And of course, arms sales went way up. In fact, that's one of the ways in which the United States has compensated for the fact that there's been an attack on the Pentagon budget. Now, the Pentagon budget is somewhat, not much, but somewhat declined because of the loss of the traditional pretext, defense against the Russians. And one of the ways they've kept things going is by expanding arms sales. And I presume what happened in here is the same, though I don't know. Now, as far as Clinton is concerned, Clinton is just another conservative Republican, I mean, I'm amazed at what I've been reading in the British press about the election. It certainly doesn't describe the country I see. I read in The Guardian the other day about how Clinton is a kind of beacon of hope for the international left after this inspiring victory and so on that really galvanized Americans. It's kind of a caricature, but something like this. Clinton was extremely unpopular. He's a conservative business candidate. He's the governor of a so-called right-to-work state. Right-to-work is a euphemism which means illegal to organize state. The Democrats in this last convention didn't even feel the need to make the usual gestures towards their traditional popular constituency. They didn't pretend to be anything other than a business party. In fact, if you look at the international financial markets, which tell you how the business community responds to things, they were either stable or actually improved after the election, because the international investors think, yeah, it's probably a good thing for the investment climate. I left the United States last night, so the last papers I read were the Sunday papers, where they interviewed Robert Reich, who's he's the kind of lefty extremist in the administration. He's one of the people who was with Clinton at Oxford. I don't know if you followed the role that Oxford plays in American mythology, but Oxford is the place where Clinton got these ideas about social engineering, which have destroyed Europe, you know, and that's why the US economy is booming while Germany collapses and so on. He and Clinton and Reich were here together, and he's sort of the, you know, the Keynesian lefty. And they had an interview with him in the Boston Globe. He's a Harvard professor. And he said, well, maybe we won't have to carry out these public works programs and investment programs and so on that we were talking about. Maybe the economy will recover on its own, although we should carry out an investment tax credit, in other words, regressive fiscal measures to benefit investors. And, you know, how anybody can be surprised at this, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the institutional structure of American politics, it's perfectly obvious. In fact, of world politics. Decision, you know, the power is in the hands of those who own the place, and they set the parameters within which decisions are made. And you don't make it into the political system until you accept those rules, and if anybody got in who tried to break them, they'd be cut off very quickly. If you can't figure it out for yourself, you can read the Wall Street Journal, which will explain exactly what would happen if some American president were crazy enough to try to carry out social welfare programs. What would happen is the international bond market, which is huge, I mean, I forget the numbers, but huge amounts of American government bonds are traded every day. I mean, astronomical numbers. The owners of the bonds would not like it, and when they don't like it, they pull out their money, which means that the interest rate goes up, which means that the economy collapses, and that's the end, okay? So if anybody were going to try to carry out these policies, they would be very quickly disciplined by what is called the market. That means the device by which the rich men who are already satisfied rule the world, okay? And Clinton isn't about to make any mistake like that. I mean, the chances that the Clinton program will reflect a slightly different understanding of how to improve the profitability of American enterprise. Maybe incidentally, some other people will benefit from it, maybe not, but that's an incident. And as far as arms sales are concerned, the United States does face a structural problem now. It's a serious one. The United States, there is no capitalist country in the world. I mean, third world countries are supposed to be capitalist, but that's so that we can destroy them. Any country that has ever successfully developed has done it by violating those principles. That's true of England, that's true of the United States, it's true all the way up to South Korea. If you take a look at the modern American economy, the parts of it that function are the parts that get enormous amounts of government protection and subsidy. Actually, a pretty good article, a letter this morning in the Financial Times on the back page by some parliamentarian whose name I didn't recognize, who gives some of the facts about this which are accurate. The United States is very heavily protectionist. The parts of the economy that function, like, say, electronics and pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, are basically state subsidized. There's no other way for that to work. The industrial program, the industrial development program in the United States has been based in the Pentagon system. If you look at things like SDI, Star Wars, the expenditures for Star Wars are distributed about the same way as the expenditures by MITI, the Japanese, Ministry of Industrial Trade and Industry, because they target the same technologies. They make roughly the same judgments about what the emerging technologies do. In the United States, the way you do it is feed it through Star Wars, but that's the function of the program, and that's the way it was sold. Well, that's gone. You know, it's getting harder and harder. This means taxpayer subsidy. The taxpayers have to agree to pay off advanced industry by paying the costs of research and development and providing a state-guaranteed, a publicly guaranteed market for waste production in the hope that something will be profitable, at which point you turn it over to private enterprise. That's what's called free enterprise or private enterprise. Public pays the costs, and if anything comes out of it, you give it to rich guys who make the profit. And it's hard to sell that to people, you know. So in the United States, the way it's been sold to people is the Russians are coming. Well, the Russians aren't coming, you know, so that makes it harder. And now there's a search for alternative techniques to develop the same programs. And that's why the people around Clinton are talking about civilian state involvement in research on civilian production to replace Pentagon production. Of course, if you look closely, it's always pre-commercial. Okay, like the National Academy of Sciences just proposed a big government corporate enterprise in which the taxpayer will pay the costs of development for pre-commercial research and development. Crucially, because as soon as it gets to be commercial, that means you can make some money out of it. It goes back to the private system. That's the way state capitalism works. And these are only matters of technical adjustment within institutional frameworks that are very resistant to change. And they will only change when the institutions change. I mean, short of that, you just have, you move up and back in a very narrow space.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bring the session to a close now, and I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking Professor Chomsky very much indeed for a tour de force and an enormously unique occasion, which this is. I'd also like to encourage you to actually look at the exhibition on East Timor, which is downstairs in the restaurant, which will be open till 10 tonight and will go on until the 13th of December. I think it's a very moving and a very special exhibition because of the way in which the photographs, particularly the ones relating to 1991, were taken, and it's an opportunity not to be missed. Thank you. Chris Wenner, who actually took the footage, the video footage in the cemetery itself, and many others who supported that work, that the world knew about what had been going on, something of what had been going on in East Timor. It was certainly not the first massacre. Aria Branca, La Cluta, Craras, there had been many massacres which had punctuated the bloody rule and occupation of the Indonesians since 1975, but this was the first time that it was actually shown across the world. Australian customs officials and authorities tried to, in fact, confiscate the tape. So sensitive was Australia to the ramifications of showing that film. And it's to their credit and to their enormous courage that we know today what we do know about East Timor, and a room like this can be filled almost to capacity in order to hear a talk on East Timor. No doubt the character of the main speaker tonight, Professor Chomsky, has been a major draw. We've hijacked him from the philosophers for one night, and we're very pleased to have been able to do so. But it's also, I think, very much due to the publicity and to the awareness, the growing awareness, which has enabled such a gathering to come into being. We'd like to send a message tonight to the people of East Timor that they have not been forgotten, that they have a hope for a better world, and that Oxford, which has a link now with the presidency in the United States, can have an influence on events, perhaps larger than one might think. There will be a student club and student society association which will be founded, called the Friends of East Timor, which will be founded at St. Anne's, and the founders are here tonight, and if you would like to know more about it, you can get in touch with me or others who are involved with work on East Timor. So without further ado, I will turn to João Boavida, who is a graduate student at Campion Hall, working on a thesis to do with nationalism and religion in East Timor. And most of all, he has been a personal witness to the events which we will be talking of tonight. Thank you. I hope you can hear me and that the mic is functioning properly. Well, ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Museum of Modern Art and to this lecture by Professor Chomsky, which is being held in conjunction with a major exhibition on East Timor, which can be seen in the downstairs in the restaurant, and I hope that you will be able to see it after this meeting. It'll be open for half an hour afterwards. The format of tonight will be that I will make a very short opening address. I will then turn to João Boavida, who is an East Timorese, who is now studying at Campion Hall, to give something of an impression of what it has been like to actually live through the years of the Indonesian military occupation, and to particularly dwell on the developments which have happened within the East Timorese Church, the Catholic Church of East Timor, and the way in which that has focused in and helped to sustain the growing nationalist resistance in East Timor. Arnold Cohen will then follow. Arnold has been almost single-handed the architect of keeping East Timor in front of the public eye in the United States during 16 years when it was extremely difficult for much of that time to really be able to hold it as an issue of major public concern because of the way in which the press and those who could report what had been going on in East Timor were excluded and were banned from visiting the territory, and also from what Professor Chomsky will be talking about in the fourth presentation, the international matrix which has kept East Timor in the position it has been in during the past 16 to 17 years. I'm a specialist on Indonesian history, and to my shame, it took me nearly 10 years to actually realize what was happening in East Timor. I remember the first indication that something was pretty seriously wrong was when I was sitting in a restaurant in Leiden.
But there is certainly an explosive phenomenon which has taken place in East Timor over the last 17 years. And this phenomenon is the real religious element, which I'm going to describe it briefly in the following terms. First and foremost, since the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, the Timorese Church has adopted an attitude of mutual accommodation with Timorese people. Throughout the 17 years of occupation, the Catholic Church in East Timor has given all sorts of supports and in several ways to the suffering East Timorese people. In other words, the Timorese Catholic Church has been the only and real haven in East Timor under those 17 years and continues to be. And secondly, as the Timorese church began to look at the Bible from the underside, that is, from the perspective of the suffering Timorese people, many East Timorese came in mass, in big numbers, and converted to Catholicism. From 30% of Catholics in 1975, when the Indonesians, or when the Portuguese government left East Timor, the number went up 60%, and now the total number of those converted to Catholicism is something around 95%. If the figure means anything at all, it must mean that this is a potentially, when I first went to Australia in 1987, I was invited to give a talk at one of the universities in Melbourne. I was quite nervous at the time because my English wasn't very good. And before the talk, there was a student who came to me and asked me whether I was the speaker. And I said yes. She then went on saying that she knew quite well about the plight of the Timorese people, and that she was very upset about her government's policy on East Timor. And then she asked me where exactly East Timor was. And she wondered whether it was somewhere in the northern suburb of Victoria. And of course I said yes, but a bit further north. So we literally went through all the suburbs around Victoria, and we ended up at the top end of Australia, which is Darwin. By then, she realized the mistake she had made, that she simply had mistaken East Timor with one of the Aboriginal tribes in Australia. Well, what exactly I want to say tonight, it's nothing complex. The simple fact that the Timorese struggle still survives today, it is mainly due to the Catholic Church and its priests in East Timor. And by this, I don't mean to undervalue the spirit of nationalism of the Timorese people themselves, and nor do I overlook the efforts of individuals and group solidarities around the world.
And read that 5 Western journalists, 2 Britons, Australians and New Zealander, had been shot and killed while covering the war at Balibo in October of '75. And I thought, well, it's a bit odd for 5 journalists and cameramen just to be wiped off the face of the earth just like that, just fulfilling their duties. And it was not until 1983, when I was asked to review the book written by James Dunn, an excellent book on East Timor called Timor, A People Betrayed, that I realized what had happened to them, that they'd been shot in cold blood by the Indonesian army, and that not only they had died, but somewhere around 100,000 Timorese out of a population of 688,000 had died in the first 3.5 years of the Indonesian occupation alone. Per capita, and in terms of the suffering per square inch in East Timor, certainly perhaps greater than that even of Pol Pot's Cambodia. In the following year, after '83, we tried to hold a meeting to coincide with a visit to Oxford by Jose Ramos Horta, who later came as a visiting fellow to St. Anthony's, and like Arnold, has been very much instrumental in terms of holding the cause of East Timor aloft in the UN and in major international circles, in the circles of diplomacy and international relations. For a very long period of time, he has been a principal advocate of East Timor's right of self-determination and the right for a future which the people of East Timor can decide for themselves. And when we organized a meeting in New College, barely 20 people turned up. It was a beautiful hall, as large as this, but 20 people were there. And I think it's a measure of the change which has been wrought during the past year, a change which occurred because of the massacre, the Santa Cruz massacre, and the way in which that massacre was reported in the West. Two of the journalists and photographers who were there at the time, Steve Cox, who took the photographs, some of which you can see downstairs in the exhibition, Peter Gordon, who headed the Yorkshire television team, which made the very moving documentary on East Timor, which was shown in January last year, both are here tonight. And it's due to the courage of Peter and Steve